With online teaching, a lot of it is going to be asynchronous. You usually will have classes that are going to be totally asynchronous. You're meeting totally online at your own pace, but there will be some cases where you might have to have synchronous sessions where with a synchronous session, it's when you and your classmates or you and your instructor and your classmates are meeting up together in live time. A lot of times that happens through video conferencing, such as Zoom or Blackboard Connect or other different platforms. Google Hangouts also is a way that you could do this. And that's really when you have a synchronous session, the time is set ahead of time. And really it's planning to meet that face-to-face that you, and usually it's through a form of technology, not necessarily in person, especially with an online class. With asynchronous communication, we see that something where it doesn't necessarily have to be in live time. That's where, as an instructor in online teaching, you could be shooting an email to your students. You could be sending a message through your LMS system. Even assignment instructions technically are a form of asynchronous communication. You're setting up your directions ahead of time. And really just this provides students with the flexibility to kind of work and communicate with you in their flexibility of really when they are able to access the learning environment. And it's really just not meeting up at that same exact time every single period. Usually when you're teaching online, you're using some sort of platform. You're either using a learning management system, you are using Google Classroom, you're using Edmodo, you're using something where you're connecting with your students through a particular platform. A lot of times these platforms have the ability to use announcements and posting to students that way. I would say that's one of my favorite tools to use. I usually like to send either, depending on the timing of the class, I like to send daily announcements or I like to send weekly announcements if it's, of a longer session of a course. And that's really one of the big highlights in how you're able to communicate. Additionally, traditional online courses oftentimes rely on discussion, and so discussion boards. It's really where you guys can actually go through and discuss things and kind of post through a forum where you're able to kind of answer a question, or if you're an instructor, you can have an FAQ session. I also like to use screencasts a lot. With these screencasts, I like to use those as a model. If I'm giving a technology that I expect my students to use, or I'm modeling for them, I like to be able to show my screen and communicate with them and explain things that way. Holding informal office hours are a really good way to connect with your students and have the ability for them to check in with you, either through, like we just said, a video conferencing platform, or some other way where your students have the ability to communicate with you right then. I also like to do notes for feedback. So depending on however your students are submitting assignments, be through Google Docs or through the cloud and sharing documents or anything like that, I like to leave comments. So if you have the ability to insert comments into an assignment or highlight things and put a quick little message to them, that feedback is a really, really big piece of communication that you have with your students, and not just having students turn something in and then they get nothing on it, but really you initiating that feedback to kind of produce that conversation, and students have the ability to communicate with you through that. My biggest piece of advice is to find a routine and find a method and stick with it. Either decide that you're going to use announcements daily or you're going to use announcements weekly and shoot out a similar message every week or every day. Rather than switching between, okay, I'm going to use an announcement one day and then I'm going to send an email another day. Stick with your platform. So if announcements are going to be your main form of communication, send it out that way. If email is going to be your main form of communication, stick with that. I like to use email in particular if I need to contact one particular student specifically or a group member specifically, so I can give kind of more personal communication with them through email. And that's really, I would just make sure that you're consistent, because a lot of times with online teaching and online learning, structure is extremely important for ensuring that students, one, are enjoying their learning experience, and two, are being successful in their learning experience. My second piece of advice would be to get to know your students. Know what is going on with their schedules, know what kind of job that they're in, and get their contact information and what they prefer as their best contact information. If you need to get in touch with students, and you're shooting out an email to the class, make sure you're shooting it out to the email that they can see. A lot of times when your students have a student email, but they don't always use that student email, or they don't check it regularly as they would with their personal email, and ask them what is the best way you would prefer to use. I also sometimes collect student phone numbers, and that's really in case of an emergency, but you might have some students where they just need to call to check in with you and ask a question, and they just want it quick. I also have had students text me before if they know that they're going to be late to an online session. It's really just knowing your students and getting their contact information. My third piece of advice would be setting the routine and setting the structure for your discussions. A lot of times with online learning, discussions are your main piece of communication with your students, and the main piece of communication from student to student. And so a lot of students that might be new to online learning, they don't necessarily know how to jump into the discussion. And so therefore establishing routines, establishing expectations of how students should participate in the discussion, and really kind of giving students a model of how they should participate, and a model of also what is a good discussion post. What do you require for them? Is it not just a student jumping in and saying great work, but giving actual constructive feedback and modeling that for students? Because a lot of times, especially when, you know, connections and relationships aren't necessarily clearly established in an online setting, because students aren't meeting students face to face, they need that personal aspect. And so they might be a little hesitate to jump into the discussion unless you kind of give them some guidelines. And that also will help you manage your discussion posts as well as you're going through and reading everything that your students are using to communicate.